They stripped my voice first, then my hands, then my face. I was a Biologis Sanctification orderly. I believed the work was holy. The moment everything changed was a Tuesday, 3 hours before the morning bell, when a servitor mopping the corridor outside Bay 17 stopped, turned its head toward me, and said, "Please." What does the Imperium do when its machines start begging? What does a man do when he realizes the machine that cooked his meals, hauled his cargo, and cleaned his waste might have been someone's father? My name is Theodan Cursk, and this is how I discovered the Imperium has been creating souls and calling it engineering. 2. ACTONETRDRLANDS Ledger. The Biologis Sanctification facility on Forge, Station Vortumn Secundus operated on a schedule so precise it had its own Saint's Day. We processed 68 augmentation conversions per standard week. No more, no fewer. The quota was blessed by the Adeptus Mechanicus priesthood on the first day of each new year, inscribed in high Gothic on a parchment that smelled of sacred oils and machine lubricant, and hung behind Supervisor Death Aris's office door, where no orderly dared look directly at it, as if the numbers themselves were consecrated. I had worked there for 9 years. I was proud of that. Not everyone lasted 9 years. The work had a way of following you home. My colleagues warned during my first week, and I had not understood what they meant until year 3, when I woke screaming from a dream I could not remember, only that it smelled of antiseptic and burned metal. After that I developed routines. I prayed to the Omnissiah each morning, which my colleagues found eccentric, as I was not of the Mechanicus, but I found that the prayers of a machine, faith suited a man who worked in a machine place. I prayed for clean instruments, steady hands, and efficient processing. I prayed that the Emperor's work moved without friction. The servitors I processed did not pray. They could not. That was part of their purpose. My role in the facility was what the Adeptus Mechanicus called a transitional support orderly, which in the plain language of bureaucracy meant I was the man who handled paperwork on one side of the augmentation process and assisted with physical preparation on the other. I was not a tech priest. I was not a chirurgeon. I was the man who verified consent documentation, cross-referenced conversion classifications against Biologis Code 7 Omicron, confirmed the appropriate authorization chains were complete, and ensured each subject was correctly sedated and positioned before the conversion team arrived. After processing, I cleaned and prepared the bay for the next scheduled subject. It was the most important administrative role in the facility that no one in the facility thought of as important. The tech priests had their blessings and their binary chants and their sacred duty of transformation. The chirurgeons had their surgical expertise and their Mechanicus rights. I had forms to fill out and tables to wipe down. But I will say this: the facility could not have functioned without me. You cannot transform a human being into a servitor without an authorization chain. The Adeptus Mechanicus are many things, but they are not anarchic. Everything requires documentation. Every soul processed required someone to sign the intake form, verify the consent classification, check the authorization seals from Mago's authority above, and log the conversion in the Sanctification ledger. That was me. I was the hinge point, the threshold between what a man had been and what he would become. I found meaning in the precision of it. I told myself that 9 years of immaculate records meant 9 years of correct procedure, and correct procedure meant the work was just. Every form completed correctly was a small prayer. Every properly verified signature was obedience to the will of the Omnissiah, as transmitted through the administrative hierarchy. I was a man who believed in paperwork the way other men believed in the God, Emperor. The two, I told myself, were not different things. The facility smelled of amniotic preservative and cold metal. That smell was home to me by year 4. There were things I did not examine too closely. Not then. The new intake subjects came to us through 3 classification channels: convicted heretics, volunteer augmentation candidates, and what the intake forms called administratively designated personnel. The first category was clear enough. The second category was smaller than you might expect, but not surprising. In a universe of endless war and grinding poverty, some men and women chose conversion willingly, trading the uncertain torment of biological life for the simpler torment of industrial servitude. They received a modest death, gratuity paid to their families, and a sanctification blessing. I processed their consent forms with respect. It was a grim choice, but it was a choice. The third category, administratively designated personnel, had a longer and more complex authorization chain. Extra seals required. Additional documentation from Supervisor Aris and sometimes from the sub, Magos, who rarely visited the floor. I processed these forms more carefully than the others, though I did not ask what administratively designated meant exactly. I assumed it meant something the Adeptus Mechanicus understood, and I did not need to. There are hierarchies of knowledge in the Imperium. The machine, priests know things the Orderlies cannot be expected to understand. I was comfortable not understanding. It seemed appropriate. The subtle wrongness began in my 9th year, 7 months before everything broke open. A subject arrived late in the processing queue, 2 hours before the end of my shift, which was unusual. Subjects were typically delivered in morning batches, sedated and positioned by the intake staff. This one arrived walking under his own power, escorted by 2 Mechanicus Skytari, and he was not sedated. He was perhaps 45 years of age, broad-shouldered, with the calloused hands of a heavy labor worker. His eyes were brown and alert. He looked at me when I stepped forward with the intake data slate, and his gaze was entirely present, entirely lucid, in a way that made me want to look away. "Orderly," he said. His voice was steady. "Is there an appeal process?" I had been an orderly for 9 years. In 9 years, no subject had asked me this. I looked at the intake form. He was classified as administratively designated personnel. Authorization seals present and correct, all in order, signed by Magos, Auxiliary Hethvran. I looked at his consent documentation. The box for voluntary conversion was unchecked. The box for involuntary conversion, legally authorized, was checked. This was not unusual for convicted heretics, but his charge line read industrial productivity deficiency, persistent, not heresy, not mutation, not any of the categories that carried conversion as a lawful sentence under the codes I knew. "I'm not the person to ask," I told him. "Who is?" he asked. I did not know. I realized in that moment that I had never needed to know. The Skitari guided him through the bay doors. I filed his intake form, cross-referenced his conversion authorization against Biologis Code 7, Omicron, and confirmed the appropriate seals were present and correct. They were. I logged him in the Sanctification ledger. His name was Pol Veris. I remember it because I checked it twice, which I had never done before, not because something was wrong with the form. The form was perfect. Something was wrong with me. I went home that night and sat very still for a long time. I told myself that the authorization was valid. I told myself that the administratively designated classification existed for reasons I was not meant to understand. I told myself that Pol Veris had eyes that were too present, too alert, and that I had let that cloud my professional judgment. I told myself that, if the Adeptus Mechanicus had determined his conversion was authorized, then it was authorized, and my role was not to question the authorization but to verify that it existed. I was almost entirely successful at telling myself these things. The next morning, I arrived at the facility 4 minutes early, which was unusual for me. I told myself I was being diligent. Pol Veris had been processed overnight and assigned to industrial duty in the lower manufacturum decks. By the time I arrived, he was already gone. I would not see him again for 6 months. But that word he used stayed with me. Appeal. He had asked for an appeal process. He had been calm and specific. He had not been frightened or irrational. He had sounded like a man who knew he was in the wrong place and was trying to navigate the correct channels to demonstrate this. He had sounded like me in my first year, when I had to argue a misfiled form up through 3 levels of administrative hierarchy to correct an error in the ledger. I was almost certain that was a coincidence. I prayed to the Omnissiah and began my morning verification rounds. The bays were cold, held at 8 degrees to maintain sterility. I could see my breath against the overhead lumen strips. There were 4 new subjects queued for morning processing, all sedated, all correctly documented. I checked their forms with the particular care I had developed after Pol Veris, reading not just the authorization seals but the charge classifications. 3 were convicted heretics. 1 was administratively designated personnel. I checked the charge line on the administratively designated form. It read Social Cohesion Risk Factor, Category 3. I filed it without further examination. I told myself this was professionalism. I have since come to understand it was fear. The thing about paperwork is that it is honest in a way that people are not. People lie, omit, rephrase, contextualize. Forms cannot. A form has boxes, and the boxes contain specific categories, and if the categories do not fit the reality, someone must still choose which box to check and live with the friction of that choice. That friction accumulates over years. It accumulates in files. It accumulates in ledgers. And if you know how to read ledgers, the friction tells you everything. I did not go looking for the truth. I want to be clear about that. I was not a dissident or an investigator or a man with an agenda. I was an orderly who had processed 9 years of intake forms and developed, after the encounter with Pulveris, a habit of reading the charge classifications more carefully than I had before. This was, I told myself, professional development. Nothing more. The first thing I noticed, in the weeks following Pulveris's processing, was that the administratively designated category was more common than I had previously registered. I had processed approximately 6,000 intake forms in 9 years. The administratively designated category appeared, based on my best recollection and the last 3 years of logbooks, I was authorized to access, in roughly 1 of every 4 intakes. This was not the exceptional rare case authorization I had assumed. This was a standing operational category used routinely, constantly, at a rate that suggested not exceptional necessity but regular policy. 1 of every 4. I checked this number 3 times across different logbook periods. It held. In some periods it was closer to 1 in 3. In no period was it below 1 in 5. I rationalized this. Perhaps the administratively designated category encompassed a broader range of legitimate circumstances than I had imagined. Perhaps there were many valid legal grounds for conversion beyond the heresy and volunteer pathways I had mentally categorized as primary. The Adeptus Mechanicus had ancient and complex legal frameworks. My understanding was incomplete. This was almost certainly an administrative category with a precise and legitimate definition that I, as an orderly, simply had not been briefed on. I told myself this for approximately 3 weeks. Then I found the charge classifications. I was not supposed to have access to the archival charge logs. They were stored in a sub-directory of the intake management system that required archivist level clearance, 2 tiers above my own. But 9 years of working within a system teaches you its habits, and one of the habits of the intake management system on Forge, Station Vortumn Secundus, was that archivist level sub-directories left their index files visible to orderly level access, even when the contents required higher clearance. I could not open the files. I could read their names. The charge classification index file had a naming convention. Each file was labeled with the charge category, the year, and the case count. I could read the labels without opening the files. I read them during my evening documentation shift when the bay was empty, and the only sound was the ventilation cycling and the distant hum of the machines in the lower decks. The charge categories for administratively designated personnel included the following, in the index file names: productivity deficit, industrial, social cohesion risk, category 1 through category 5, administrative surplus population, infrastructure labor requirement, emergency fulfillment, political instability prevention, precautionary, population renewal cycle, scheduled. I sat with that list for a long time in the cold and quiet of the empty bay. Population renewal cycle, scheduled. That phrase was not a legal charge category. That was a maintenance term, like servicing ventilation filters or rotating fuel reserves. Someone had written population renewal cycle on an index file that contained records of human beings processed into servitors. I told myself there was an explanation. I told myself the file naming convention was shorthand that compressed complex legal language into administrative labels. I told myself I did not understand the full scope of Mechanicus resource management doctrine and should not draw conclusions from vocabulary alone. These rationalizations were less convincing than my previous ones. They felt thin. I noticed that they felt thin, which was itself a new and uncomfortable sensation. I did not access the archival files. I was not certain I wanted to know what was in them. I filed my evening documentation and went home. The second discovery came through the servitor pools rather than the archives, and it came because of Pulveris. 6 months after his processing, I was walking the transitional bay corridor during a quiet afternoon shift when one of the facility's labor servitors, a unit I had seen daily for 3 years without particular notice, stopped in the corridor outside Bay 17 while performing its cleaning function and turned its head toward me. This was not unusual. Servitors tracked nearby biological heat signatures as part of their operational awareness routines. What was unusual was what happened next. The servitor opened its mouth. The Vox grill installed in its jaw produced a sound that was primarily mechanical grinding, the kind of sound that indicated a Vox unit damaged or improperly calibrated. But beneath the grinding, in the spaces between, shaped by something that was using the damaged mechanism as best it could, there was a word. Please. I stopped walking. I stood in the corridor and stared at the servitor. It was an older unit, chassis worn with years of service, its augmented components showing the marks of multiple repair cycles. Its biological components, the face, the eyes, the organic remnants of whatever person it had been were preserved under the standard conversion protocol. Its eyes were brown. I thought of Pulveris. Brown eyes. The right height. The right age of biological component, if 6 months of servitor metabolic processing was accounted for. I could not be certain. I had not spent long enough looking at Pulveris's face to be certain of anything, except that his eyes had been brown and alert, and this servitor's eyes were brown, and contained something that I had, in 3 years of daily proximity, never noticed or chosen to notice. The servitor's mouth worked again. The damaged Vox grill ground and clicked. Please. And then, after a long pause in which its cleaning implement continued its automatic motion, as if detached from whatever was happening above. Mem. Brr. Then the unit's posture changed. Something went out of it, or returned, or both at once. It resumed its cleaning function and moved down the corridor without further deviation. I stood in the empty corridor for a long time. I will tell you what I told myself, because I want you to understand that I tried very hard not to know what I was beginning to know. I told myself that damaged Vox units produced random phonemic noise that the human brain, pattern matching as it was built to do, resolved into apparent words. I told myself that older servitors developed tick behaviors as their behavioral algorithms degraded, and that these ticks could mimic intentional action without representing intentional action. I told myself that the resemblance to Pulveris was a projection born of guilt I should not have felt about a properly authorized intake I had correctly processed. I told myself all of this. And then I went to the intake log and looked up Pulveris's unit assignment, and I walked to Bay 17, and I opened the corridor, external maintenance record, and I confirmed that the labor servitor assigned to Bay 17 corridor was Unit V2247, intake processed 6 months ago from subject file Pulveris, administratively designated personnel charge, industrial productivity deficiency, persistent. That was the night I stopped sleeping normally. I need to explain what it means, what it costs, to hold a discovery like this inside professional routine. I continued my shifts. I processed my intake forms. I verified my authorization seals. I checked my charge classifications with what I now recognized was not professional development, but desperate, compulsive searching. Because once I had looked up one charge classification, I could not stop looking. Not because I wanted confirmation, because I was hoping each time to find the explanation that would resolve the wrongness back into sense. Instead, I found the third discovery, and the third discovery was about scale. I had access to the last 3 years of logbooks. 3 years contained exactly 151 weeks. I counted the administratively designated intakes in those weeks, and arrived at a figure I do not want to tell you but will. 611 subjects. In 3 years. On this facility alone, one facility among the hundreds operating across Vortumn Secundus. One forge station among the hundreds in this subsector alone. The Adeptus Mechanicus operates at a scale that makes arithmetic obscene. 611 subjects in 3 years on a single station. Charge classifications including population renewal cycle, scheduled. A servitor with brown eyes that said please. I cross-referenced the population renewal cycle charge classification dates. They came in clusters, every 22 months. A batch of 30 to 40 administratively designated intakes arrived within a 2-week window, classified under that specific charge. Every 22 months. Like a maintenance cycle, like rotating supplies, like renewing a population the way you renew fuel cells. I understood then, for the first time, that this was not a category of exception. This was a feature of the system, as deliberate and scheduled as the quarterly sanctification blessings and the annual quota inscription. That was the last normal shift of my career. Those were the last hours in which I could tell myself I was documenting justice rather than participating in something I did not yet have a name for. The thing about a system is that it has architects. Systems do not emerge from nowhere, do not sustain themselves through accident or inertia alone. Someone builds them. Someone defends them. Someone, if you find the right doorway, will explain them to you in a flat, tired voice, because they have been explaining them for a very long time, and the exhaustion of justification has long since replaced whatever passion originally animated the justification. I found my architect through an act of cowardice that I have since decided to call courage. I submitted a formal inquiry to Supervisor Death Aris, requesting a clarification meeting regarding the administratively designated personnel classification and the legal framework governing the population renewal cycle charge category. I submitted it through official channels, in triplicate, using the correct form. I was an orderly who believed in paperwork. I submitted my crisis through the appropriate administrative channel and waited to be called in. Aris called me in 4 days later. His office smelled of recaf and old parchment and something chemical I never identified. He was 60 or close to it, a thick man with the permanent exhaustion that long administrative service produces. Not the exhaustion of hard physical labor, but the deeper exhaustion of a man who has made certain decisions and continues making them, and carries the accumulated weight of every one. He had been supervisor for longer than I had been orderly. He gestured at the chair across his desk without looking up from the form he was reading. "Sit," he said. "I'll come to you." He finished the form, signed it, set it in the outgoing tray, and picked up the next one. He signed that one too. Then he folded his hands on the desk and looked at me. "You've been here 9 years, he said. "Yes, sir." "Good work. The ledgers are clean." He said this without warmth, the way you note a functional piece of equipment. "You're asking about the AD classification." "I'm asking about the charge categories, sir. Specifically population renewal cycle. I want to understand the legal framework." "No, you don't," he said. The flatness of it silenced me. He said it the way you'd correct a technical misunderstanding, not unkindly. Accurately. He was quiet for a moment. His hands, I noticed, were very still in a way that suggested effort. The stillness of hands that shook when not deliberately controlled. The legal framework is the Mechanicus Biological Resource Management Protocols, Section 14 through 17, issued in M38 and amended 6 times since. He was not reading from anything. He had it memorized. Section 15 codifies the right of forge. Station administrators to designate population elements for conversion when biological resource requirements cannot be met through voluntary intake and convicted heretic channels. The population renewal cycle is a subsection defining the scheduling parameters for proactive rather than reactive population management. He picked up his recaf cup. It was empty. He put it down. "Proactive," I said. "Proactive. That means before there's a demonstrated need. That means," he said, "that we do not wait until the servitor pool degrades below operational capacity before replenishing it. We maintain the pool at optimal levels on a predictive schedule." I sat with that. "And the charge classification population renewal cycle is applied to subjects designated for that replenishment." "Yes. They haven't done anything." His hands moved, separated, pressed flat against the desk. He closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, they were the same flat and tired as before. "That is correct," he said. "Population renewal cycle subjects are selected on demographic criteria, age range, skill transferability, social network assessment, family status. We minimize secondary disruption." He paused. "We try to take people who will not be catastrophically missed." I heard myself ask, do they know before intake? Do they know why? They receive a general conscription notification. The specific legal basis is attached. Most do not read it carefully, and Paul Veris read it. Something moved across Aris's face, not guilt. Closer to recognition. The look of a man who has seen a particular kind of record before and knows exactly where it ends. Varys filed an inquiry. Aris said. It was assessed and denied. He was processed on schedule. Asked me if there was an appeal process. There isn't one for this category. He picked up his pen. Not to write anything, I thought. Something to hold. There isn't time for one. If every renewal cycle subject could appeal and halt processing while the appeal worked through the hierarchy, the cycle would never complete. The station would fall behind quota. The servitor pool would degrade. Operations would deteriorate. People would die. People are dying now. People designated for conversion are incorporated into essential infrastructure, and I am not going to have an ethical debate with you today. His voice had dropped slightly, the flatness shading towards something grayer. I have been having this debate, internally, for 22 years. I do not need a fresh interlocutor. I looked at the parchment on the wall behind him. The annual quota inscription, blessed by the Mechanicus, written in High Gothic. I had never been close enough to read it before. Sir, I said, does the Adeptus Mechanicus believe that servitors retain consciousness after conversion? He was very still for a very long time. The approved doctrine, he said finally, is that conversion eliminates independent cognition and replaces it with directed behavioral programming. The biological component is retained for neurological substrate only. Consciousness, as defined by Biologis doctrine, does not persist. That's the approved doctrine, I said. Yes? What do you believe? He did not answer immediately. He put down the pen. He put both hands flat on the desk again, and I could see, now, the fine tremor running through them that he was working to keep still. I believe, he said, that the approved doctrine was written by people who needed it to say what it says. I believe that Biologis research on the question has been conducted by institutions with a vested interest in a particular outcome. He stopped. He looked at the wall rather than at me. I believe that certain older units in this facility exhibit anomalous behavioral patterns that the maintenance team attributes to algorithm degradation. I have never investigated those anomalous patterns closely. I have chosen not to know. Why? I asked, though I already knew. Because if they retain consciousness, he said, then the approved doctrine is not doctrine, it is a cover story. And if it is a cover story, then what we do here is not sanctified transformation of biological substrate in service of the Omniscia's manifest plan. It is something else entirely, with a name that I am not willing to say aloud in this office or any other. He looked at me again. His hands were shaking now and he had stopped trying to stop them. I have processed, in 22 years, approximately 14,000 subjects under the administratively designated classification. I have reviewed the population renewal cycle documentation for every scheduled intake. I have signed the forms. I have verified the authorizations. If the doctrine is false, then I have spent 22 years building something that I cannot name and will not survive naming. The office was cold. I had not noticed how cold it was until I stopped speaking. I have reviewed the quota for next month's renewal cycle, he said. His voice had gone flat again, the flatness of a man retreating from a cliff edge back into routine. 42 subjects. I will need your documentation support for the intake processing. He picked up a form from his outgoing tray and held it out. This is your formal response to your inquiry. It states that your questions were addressed within the framework of existing doctrine, and that no further administrative review is required. Sign it and return it to my filing system. That closes the matter. I looked at the form. Standard format, boxes already completed, a space for my signature at the bottom. I thought about Unit V2247, cleaning the corridor outside Bay 17, its damaged Vox grill grinding out a word it should not have been able to form. Sir, I said, I think it knows it's him. The unit. I think something is still in there. Aris's jaw tightened. He said nothing for a long moment. Sign the form, he said. But I was already thinking about what I had not yet found. If there was doctrine, as Aris had hinted, built to accommodate what happened in this facility, then the doctrine had authors. It had a text. And if I was going to understand what I was participating in, I needed to read the text, because I was, after all, a man who believed in paperwork. I believed the documents told the truth if you knew how to read them. I took the form. I folded it and put it in my coat. I did not sign it. Aris watched me do this. He said nothing. I think, In some part of him he had carefully buried under 22 years of compliance. He was grateful. I found the text in the facility's reference archive 3 days later. It was not hidden. It was filed under Biologis doctrine, supplementary frameworks, available to archivist-level clearance, which I accessed by borrowing a colleague's credentials while she was on her rest shift. I am not proud of this. I was past the point of caring about professional propriety. The document was titled On the Theological Status of Augmented Biological Substrate, a Framework for Administrative and Operational Clarity. It was dated from M41 and attributed to an Ordo Mechanicus theological review body, whose name I did not recognize. It ran to approximately 400 pages. I read the relevant sections in 6 hours, crouched in the reference archive alcove in the cold quiet of the late shift, my back aching and my mouth dry. The document was meticulous. It reviewed the theological question of whether the soul, as understood by both the Adeptus Ministorum and the Adeptus Mechanicus, persisted through the augmentation, conversion process. It reviewed historical Mechanicus doctrine on the subject going back 3,000 years. It reviewed the outcomes of various research programs, some sanctioned and some not, that had attempted to assess whether cognitive or spiritual continuity existed in converted subjects. It concluded, in language of precisely calibrated ambiguity, that the question could not be definitively resolved, but that for operational and administrative purposes, the doctrine of non-persistence was functionally necessary and should be maintained. Functionally necessary. Not true. Not theologically established. Functionally necessary. I found the appendix 18 pages from the end. It was labeled Supplementary Research Findings Sealed, but the document I was reading was itself the unsealed version, the reference archive copy, and whoever had redacted the supplementary findings for sealed distribution had not remembered to redact the reference archive copy. This happens. Archives are vast, bureaucracies are imperfect, papers that should be sealed are occasionally not sealed. This is how history sometimes survives. The supplementary research findings described 3 formal research programs conducted over a period spanning approximately 200 years in 3 different facilities in 3 different subsectors. The programs used different methodologies, but they were investigating the same question: did cognitive continuity, and specifically the functional analog of what Ministorum doctrine called the soul, persist through the servitor conversion process? The findings of all 3 programs were consistent in subjects for whom pre-conversion cognitive baseline data was available. 40 to 70% of converted servitors displayed measurable signs of what the researchers carefully labeled residual baseline, coherent behavioral patterning, responses to stimuli that could only be explained by reference to pre-conversion memory and identity, reaction patterns to sounds, faces, and language consistent with unaugmented baseline behavior. In some cases, vocalization. In some cases, in units with sufficiently intact vox capability, something the researchers had documented as communicative attempt. Please, a servitor said in the cold corridor, remember, 40 to 70% of converted subjects. Not algorithm degradation, not random phonemic noise, residual baseline, coherent behavioral patterning. Something the document was careful never to call consciousness. Careful never to call a soul, because naming it would collapse the doctrine, and the doctrine was functionally necessary. I sat in the archive alcove with the 400-page document on the data, slate in my hands, and I understood for the first time everything. I understood why the doctrine of non-persistence had to exist. I understood why the population renewal cycle had to operate without an appeal process. I understood why the charge classifications were what they were. I understood why Pulveris had been processed despite his objection, and I understood why Aris had not investigated the anomalous behavioral patterns in the older units. And I understood why the supplementary research findings were meant to be sealed. Because if 40 to 70% of converted subjects retained something recognizable as continuity of self, then the Adeptus Mechanicus was not transforming biological substrate. It was imprisoning people in metal, in servitude, awake, aware, unable to do anything but the function they had been augmented to perform, forever, until the biological components degraded and the unit was decommissioned. 14,000 subjects, in 22 years, in this facility alone, And Aris had said he tried to minimize secondary disruption, took people who would not be catastrophically missed. How many facilities? How many forge stations? How many forge worlds? How many centuries? I thought about Unit V2247 cleaning the corridor outside Bay 17. I thought about what it cost him. If something in there that was still pulveris pushed a word through a damaged Vox grill, and the word was please. What it cost to surface that. Whether it happened every day, or only sometimes, or whether there was mercy in the loss of moments between surfacing. Whether some of them stopped surfacing, and what that meant, and whether it was peace or erasure. I did not leave the archive immediately. I sat for what might have been 2 hours. The ventilation hummed. The cold was absolute. I thought about 9 years of forms I had filed, 611 administratively designated intakes in the last 3 years alone. And I thought about each of those 611 human beings, and what it meant that 40 to 70% of them might be still in there, behind the metal and the coolant lines, cleaning corridors, hauling freight, working the manufacturum floors in the lower decks where the heat and the noise were perpetual, and the shifts were endless. I could not unmake 9 years. I could not unmake 6,000 forms. I could not open the conversion bays and reverse the augmentation on every unit in this facility, but I could not sign Aris's form. CT for you Tyrakanafav. I have been dead for 11 years. The Mechanicus Security Division executed me 8 hours after I refused to sign the form. Submitted a formal report to the Ordo Mechanicus Oversight Board documenting the discrepancy between the sealed and unsealed versions of the supplementary research findings, and requested a full inquiry into the Population Renewal Cycle Authorization Framework. I was informed my inquiry had been received. I was informed that the relevant documentation had been located and would be correctly sealed. I was informed that my security clearance was revoked effective immediately, and that my employment was terminated, and that pursuant to protocols governing individuals who had accessed sealed research materials without authorization, I was subject to immediate processing. They offered me voluntary conversion. I declined. They processed me anyway. I understand the irony of that. I found it almost clarifying at the time. The charge classification would have been social cohesion risk factor, category 3. I know this because I had read the index file, and I was now exactly what those words described. I am telling you this from the other side of that processing, because I did one thing in the 8 hours between submitting my report and my arrest that Aris did not anticipate. I found the facility's external communication array, which was accessible to archivist-level credentials, and I transmitted a copy of my report and the relevant archive documents to the highest number of separate addressees I could reach before the Security Division located me. I addressed it to every ordo and sub-order I could find in the communication index. I addressed it to Administratum archives on 3 adjacent forge stations. I addressed it to a navigator house that had trade connections in the subsector, whose address I found in the facility's shipping records, because I had come to believe, in those hours, that institutions with a stake in trade were sometimes more durable record keepers than institutions with a stake in doctrine. I do not know if any of those transmissions reached their destinations. I do not know if any of them were read. I do not know if anyone who received them did anything, or could do anything, or chose to do anything. I know that the Imperium is vast beyond imagining, and that the mechanisms of its maintenance are ancient and entrenched, and protected by exactly the kind of doctrine that is functionally necessary regardless of truth. But I made the record. And a record can survive, the way archive copies sometimes survive when sealed versions are correctly sealed too late. You have found this. This is the archive copy. You are reading it because it was not correctly sealed, or because the copy I sent reached someone who kept it, or because 11 years is long enough for a record to travel through channels I cannot predict from where I am. I do not know if the Omniscient hears the prayers of the converted. I do not know if what persists in 40 to 70% of servitors constitutes something the God Emperor cares for, or knows, or acknowledges. I know that a man named Pulveris stood in a cold processing bay and asked me if there was an appeal process, and that I told him I was not the person to ask, and that I was wrong. There should be an appeal process. If you are reading this, and you have the authority to build one, build one. If you are reading this, and you do not have that authority, remember Pol Veris. Remember that Unit V-2247 cleaned a corridor for 6 months and said one word through a broken Vox grill. And it was the word that people say when they need something from you that they cannot make you give. Remember that the Imperium runs on their labor. Every forge world, every war machine, every ship, the infrastructure of 10,000 years of human survival in the dark, maintained by hands and arms and neural substrate that may, 40 to 70% of the time, and know exactly what they are doing, and exactly what they cannot stop doing, and exactly what was taken from them to make them do it. What do we owe them? I do not have an answer. I had 9 years to ask the question and 8 hours to act on it, and I am not certain the action was enough, or that any action could be enough. But someone must know. Someone must ask the question. The corridor outside Bay 17 is very cold. The ventilation hums. Unit V-2247 is still in there. If the biological component has held, he is probably still cleaning. He cannot do anything else. His eyes are brown. They blink. Is anyone listening? This record was compiled from archived documents and transmission logs recovered from Forge, Station Vortumn Secundus, dated approximately 11 standard years prior to this notation. The originating party is listed in facility records as Theodan Cursk, Biologis Sanctification Orderly, status processed. The supplementary research documents referenced in this record were re-sealed following the incident. The population renewal cycle continues on schedule. You who find this, the forms are still being filed. The ledgers are still immaculate. Someone is making them that way. The Omnissiah is said to see all that runs in the machine. Perhaps that is the most terrible thing of all.